afternoon. I guess it's good afternoon for you, John.
Yeah, it is. It's afternoon here.
Excellent. So it's 6 p.m. in the UK. It's 1 p.m. in Toronto, and this is also the time.
No, 2 p.m.
But that's just a
Yeah,
couple of weeks.
Yeah, a couple of
Couple
weeks.
of weeks.
Yeah.
So we made sure that when our course begins, which is in 3 weeks from now in April, they will actually have we're out of winter time by that time. So it'll be 1 p.m. then.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's why we're here. We're here to introduce John's new course on God and the Between and William Desmond.
Yes.
So John's going to introduce his course. Enrollment is now open. I'll share the link with you all in a second. If you have questions for John, either on this course or anything that John has been working on recently, just ask your question in the chat and we'll get to the question in the end. We'll be here until about 7 p.m. my time, so about 55 minutes. Okay, John, what is your new course about on God and the Between? God and everything in between, or
no. So as we were talking about off camera, this is intended to do sort of two things at the same time. I'm structuring it and I'm going to teach it as a standalone course, but I'm also structuring it and teaching it as something that picks up a line of thinking I've been developing in the other two courses. I've been fortunate enough to teach on Halkyan, Beyond Nihilism and Ultimate Reality, God and Beyond, which has been, I guess, the unifying theme about running through that is the possibility of moving beyond a nihilistic framework in which it makes sense again to think about, talk about, experience the sacred as something that's life-giving in our lives. And this is no easy task. The reasons why Nietzsche's madmen famously pronounced God is tot. Gott ist tot. I'm doing it in German because Johannes is German. I'm trying to impress him.
That's the second pronunciation. Yeah.
Pardon me?
That was a good pronunciation.
Oh, thank you. Well, I had to do German, at least translation for my PhD. So, I mean, the reasons that Nietzsche gave for that were very significant. There's a whole development from philosophy, Descartes, Kant onward. Many of you are familiar with, because of Halkyan, with some of Heidegger's arguments about that history and how it's the history of nihilism. And so responding to this challenge isn't going to be met just by sort of an easy nostalgic conservatism or a now, I hope we're getting to the point where we're discrediting any kind of Promethean utopianism. And instead, what we need something that is simultaneously oriented both ways. And for me, this is what Desmond represents. Desmond represents, that's about how he's going forward. Desmond comes along at the same time that in which I'm doing a very deep studying, reading of Hegel and related people revising Hegel like Brandom and others with my good friend Dan Chiappi. And the thing about Desmond is he takes Hegel very seriously. He says the problem is, this is almost a verbatim quote, the problem is most people are not smart enough to criticize Hegel, which is a pretty damning thing to say for a guy who generally doesn't come across as arrogant. And what he means is he takes Hegel very, very seriously, but he thinks there is a way of moving beyond Hegel that is nevertheless not the move we see in postmodernism. And so why that's very interesting, and this is what's being explored in the first book we're going to do in the course, Religion, Metaphysics, and the Postmodern, William Desmond and John Caputo by Christopher Ben Simpson, is a way of moving outside of that whole history. Desmond, as you'll see, is profoundly influenced by Heidegger, but moving beyond it in a way that nevertheless does something that is also needed. And I've been arguing this both in the courses I've taught for Halkyan and also, in public discussions I've had with Johannes and other people, which is a recovery of Platonism or renewal of Platonism, Of course, I'm not going to say a Neoplatonism because that's ridiculous. But uh, and this recovery is very interesting because it does something that also will sound strange to a lot of people's ears, which is recover Plato, but also do that from within the depths of a very rigorous phenomenology. So that European philosophy has largely seen itself. Not so much Husserl. There's a lot of Platonism in Husserl, but post Husserl is kind of a rejection of Platonism. And one of my favorite quotes, I forget, I've tried to trace it down and I can't find it. The one thing that binds all of postmodernism is a hatred of Plato. And so Desmond is turning away, and this is how he's different from Caputo. He's turning away from that rejection of Plato, but the Plato he's giving us is not an arid, abstract, purely conceptual, purely intellectual, theory of the forms in some other world. It's very much in line with what's been called third way Platonism, that I've been reading a lot, studying a lot, and it's coming more and more dominant in the Platonic discourse. And so what that means is we've got something. The only other person I've seen that's doing this is John Rusin, is that we're discovering Plato in the depths of a very rigorous and penetrating reflection on the phenomenological structures and processes and dynamics of our experience, and doing this in a way that is integrated with a profound way of responding to the Hegelian critique and ultimately to the Kantian critiques that set it in motion. I haven't been able to find this anywhere else. This entire constellation. I found bits and pieces. The Kyoto School was doing some things that are very interesting, but what Desmond is doing is truly astonishing. And how it works is Desmond picks up on a really central idea in Plato that has only recently come back into the center of discussion, which is this idea of metexu, the between, and the idea that human beings are inherently between. This is, of course, most famously discussed, but not singularly discussed, in the Symposium, where Socrates compares himself and is compared to the daemonic, not demonic, the daemonic, the realm between the humans and the gods. And Eros is compared to that, the sort of the primal human longing to be one with what is most real, what is true, good, and beautiful. And the notion is that this is reciprocally bound up with a recognition of a proper inhabiting of our own humanity, which is that which holds together, which is between finitude and transcendence. We are the finite transcendent, or the finitude capable of transcendence. And this is the idea that Plato argues that we have to hold these two together. And one of the jobs of philosophy is to properly situate us, make us inhabit and identify with our humanity. Because if we only identify with our finitude, we fall into despair, into servitude. If we only identify with our transcendence, we fall prey to hubris.
It turns into the bad infinite, as Hegel points out.
Yes.
So you see, for example, just briefly, if I may,
of course,
be metaxu in between. Here's the Greek word, by the way, that John just mentioned. The bad infinite would be the finite making itself infinite.
Yes.
So, by the way, could be that actually Heidegger falls into that trap a little bit towards the end of his thinking. And also, though, if you look at some movements, for example, the Don't Die movement, which was born in Silicon Valley, which is just the extension of life for the sake of extending. So it's extending the finite by any means necessary. And that ultimately is an example of how the bad infinite returns if you don't take seriously, as for Hegel, there can be. It's difficult to describe, and I couldn't do it top of my head, but that there is infinity in the finite. And I think we find that in Plato. We find that in Aristotle and others already as well, of course.
And the thing that, thank you, Johannes, the thing that Desmond does is he says this notion, which can sound very abstract, in the finite and the transcendence. Desmond wants to argue we can recover it in the depths of our phenomenological experience. So this is a point of convergence between his work and my work. I have been arguing for quite some time in terms of relevance realization about transjectivity, that deeper than the subjective and the objective is that which is between. Between doesn't just mean intermediate, it means intermediary. It's not just between spatially, it also binds and mutually grounds and makes possible any relationship between. And Desmond is very much talking about that. So if you want to think about it, and these two axes have come out in the other courses, there's a horizontal metaxu, right? That is beneath, binds, is intermediary, or metaxu, between the subjective and the objective. And there's a vertical metaxu, like, again, metaxu, not just intermediate, but intermediary, right? Between the finite and the transcendent. And what he's trying to do is show how those are richly the case within our phenomenological experience. And then he proposes two developmental models. He developed, one is our sense of being. And he argues that it goes through, he calls it the fourfold of being. So he says we start out with I'll use his terms, but then I'll quickly explain what they are. He says, in our experience, we just have a univocal sense of being. There's just one sense of what it is to be, and that's it. And right, and it's a kind of, no questions really get asked. There's questions within that framework, but the framework itself is no. Being is just this one thing, and it might be being is the one substance or whatever, right? You just have this one. That's it. There's a single answer to what is being. And then he says that gives way to all kinds of problems, the classic problems of the one and the many, which are not just conceptual. They're in our experience. Somehow our experience seems to be one, but it also seems to be many. And so when we try to wrestle with that perennial problem, we move to what he calls the equivocal sense of being, which is we have multiple senses of being and they don't all mean the same thing, and we move around in them. And he says that can go in many directions. It can go in nominalism, and he says it's most famously the case in postmodernism. Postmodernity is basically arguing, when it says things like there's no meta narratives, it's arguing, this is his argument. Of course, I have to make his argument. I'm just referring to it now, right? What it's doing is it's saying that the meaning of being, the sense of being, not just the conceptual meaning, the sense of being is properly equivocal. And he uses, Christopher Ben Simpson uses John Caputo as somebody who's making that argument about religion, about Christianity, about faith, about the experience of God, right? Now, and then William Desmond argues, but it doesn't have to stay there. This is what you then can move is the dialectical. And here he has Plato in mind, but most prominently, because he's written extensively on Hegel, he has Hegel in mind. Mm-hmm. And the idea here is, well, you get mediation between, right, all the differences, and you get a reconciliation. And Desmond doesn't just fall into the usual critiques of Hegel. He's totalizing, and the problem with totalization and how it bumps up against Gödel and other issues like that. He's not denying them, but that's not what he's foregrounding. He says there's an issue there that isn't completely true to our experience, our sense of being. Here's where he lines up with Hartmut, Rosa, and other, and here's where the doorway starts to open to the sacred. Not that Hegel didn't talk about the sacred, but this is especially where William Desmond and Hegel are sort of. Desmond says the problem with the dialectic is it's how the different ultimately gets integrated back into the same. And so that transcendence ultimately folds back into immanence.
Yes, there's absolutely no transcendence. To quote my Hegel teaches Stephen Holgate, I'm afraid it's got to go. So,
Yes,
transcendence, that is. So there's
yes,
this sheer immanence, and Hegel also said philosophy must not be edifying, soll nicht erbaulich sein. So it
yes.
has to be dry, paint gray with gray. So
You did a wonderful little short on that as well. I remember.
yeah,
Uh,
that's fine. Yeah,
So, and then Desmond says that's just not true to our experience. We have an experience, and here's where I don't think he's aware of, but he's lining up with people like Michael Polanyi and others. We get this sense of an inexhaustibleness that comes to us, a moreness that right, that is radically disruptive. Um, and so Desmond is going to that we actually have these two senses of being. One captured, he thinks, pretty perfectly by Hegel, which is that which confirms, that which folds together, that which holds together, that which is completely intelligible. But he says we have another sense of realness, which is that which completely transcends our expectations, takes us by a surprise, breaks our frame, and confronts us with an inexhaustibility that is always to some degree unintelligible to us. Um, and so he says,
yeah,
but what happens is we now realize that it's not that right, that there's not only a dialectic this way, there's something coming out from us calling us into the dialectic. We can get more about what he's trying to talk about there, but we have this sense of right, of a what he calls a real transcendence. So we have, there's the strangeness of being. There is the inner sense of transcendence that we can't get to the bottom of the psyche, like Heraclitus says. The psyche has a logos that always exceeds itself, a
yeah,
logos that always exceeds itself. And then he says, then we have it. We often have experiences, and here's where he's very open to mysticism. We have experiences of of pure, like something like pure transcendence, and this is where he starts to connect with aspects of Neoplatonism that talked about that, non-duality, aspects within Eastern religions that talk about this. And so he thinks when you get to non-duality,
yeah.
then you get into what he calls the metaxological, which is a dialectic, but it's not a completely immanent dialectic. It's a dialectic that is also where you're not just speaking in a self-determining fashion, you're being spoken to in an other determination of you. And so his model, of course, is the one that Plato has, this dialogical model, this model that the dialogue of the soul can enter into a dialogical relationship with the good. It can never get right. It can never encompass the good. It can never encompass the one, but it can always reciprocally open. And you can see why I find this a very attractive proposal.
Yeah.
You want to say something, Johannes?
No, no. I just remembered I taught Plato's Politeia last year, and someone asked towards the end, "Does dialectics ever end?" And I said, "No. Why would it?"
Yeah.
No, there's a continuous dialogue. So yeah, okay, good. It's just it doesn't end.
So he has the fourfold sense, and then he has also what you might call a psychological. So he's
Yeah,
doing two sides of the phenomenological. He's doing this existential, which I
yeah,
just laid out to you, but he's also doing a psychological, which I also like about him.
yeah.
He says we start out with what he calls first astonishment, which is just we get that. Everybody, well, I shouldn't be so presumptuous. Many people that I've spoken to can report this moment when they realize, why is there something rather than nothing? And they're not asking for the first cause. They're not asking for the Big Bang.
They're not Leibniz, you say?
Well, they're not Leibniz, and this is his point. I remember reading in Eric Pearl and his thing on thinking being about classical metaphysics. He said at the heart of it was this continual sort of but the mystery of being, which is, and Desmond says, the problem with first astonishment is it's completely ineffable, completely inarticulate, and then it gives way to a kind of perplexity, where we try to somehow. It says the page it needs to be reloaded. Am I still here, Johannes?
Yeah, you're here.
Okay, I don't know what that was. Okay, and so we try to turn this mystery into, and this is a well chosen term, not wonder, but curiosity. We think if we can answer, like, what's the Big Bang, and we think
Yeah.
we can somehow unfold this and that, and then we get to, right, what he calls second perplexity. We start to realize that all of these endeavors, right, are not getting at it, and we have to turn to something more profound. We have to resituate ourselves in the metaxu. And then he says what that opens up is, and this is somewhat similar to Ricoeur's second naivete, we get second astonishment. That's
Yeah.
the goal of the whole of this. We return to second astonishment, where although it also puts us towards the ineffable, it's an ineffable that is post propositional, not pre propositional.
Mm-hmm.
Did you want to say something, Johannes?
Does he? Well, that's maybe something we should discuss at the course. But does he have a need for the idea, or the absolute idea, or anything that? So
No.
in Hegel, to summarize this briefly, Hegel's
Yep, please.
logic arrives at the idea, doesn't presuppose it. If you believe him, I do, but that's a different story. I'm not shelling, but the idea also has to forget itself. The idea begins to look outward and becomes, it's very extremely simplified, but it becomes nature as it looks outside. Nature is the idea that doesn't know itself, etc. So, is there anything akin to that in Desmond, etc.?
I don't know if there. I mean, he not in the books we're reading. He's got a book of God's Counterfeit where he thinks he's very wary of any idea of the absolute. Um, I understand what you're trying to get, though. There's something functionally there. See, for him,
Yeah, well, yeah, even just
yeah,
functionally, yes.
yeah. Well, I mean, so God is sort of something like absolute transcendence. That's where the absolute comes in. Um,
Can thinking take that position? I mean,
can
we
thinking
as finite thinkers, finite thinking beings.
So he's very much in the idea, and this is the other in between, the metaxis, right? That we can participate in it, and so that the metaxological,
Yeah,
not just the dialectical, actually shifts us, helps us remember. I'll use some of my language, but I don't think it's inappropriate.
yeah.
All the non propositional, and we recover our participation in it, which is something more like the transformations in our experience signify
Yeah.
what I think you're trying to point to, but we can't actually ever capture that in a concept. That's what
Mm.
he would argue.
Excellent. Thank you very much. I'll give you a bit of a break now, and I'll just share with everyone who's here and just joined maybe that we are introducing John's new course. I was afraid I almost said God. Um, so John's new course on God and the Between, which begins on Wednesday, April the 2nd at 6 p.m. UK time and 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. If you follow the link in the description, in the chat, it takes you to the enrollment page, and John will go over what the course will be on, specifically in the lectures, in terms of which other thinkers will address, etc. Now you could choose from private tutorials with John, or the philosophical fellowship, which includes live lectures. Maybe John, you could also mention say a few words on what the lectures will be like and the seminar discussions, etc. So that'll be over Zoom, obviously. And if you don't have time for the seminars, I'd say this. So there's 8 in total. If you can make at least 4, then you should join this tier. If you don't have time, then take the self-study tier and learn at your own pace. We record all sessions, including the Q&A and seminars, so you get access to those indefinitely. There's also payment plans and friend coupons if you'd like to sign up for you and a friend or a couple of friends for the seminars. Just choose that and we'll email you coupons. So Again, head over to the enrollment page and sign up. So we'll begin in 3 weeks, so there's enough time you can start reading. Maybe, Sean, you could just go over some of the details of the course now,
Yeah,
and what people can expect.
very, very welcome to do so. So we will be taking a look at, and we'll break it down into sections. We're going to be concentrating on 2 books about Desmond, and then along the way we'll be reading some primary source about primary source, which is an anthology of primary sources from Desmond. Sorry about that clumsiness. The first book, as I mentioned, is Religion, Metaphysics, and the Postmodern.
Yeah.
And this is Christopher Ben Simpson. And what we'll be doing is we'll be looking at his engagement with probably, and I agree with Ben Simpson about this. And Ben Simpson is a deep reader of both Desmond and Caputo. And Caputo is a deep reader of Heidegger. Caputo's book, for example, on the mystical element in Heidegger's thought, I think is like kind of a masterpiece. And so Caputo has been a premier, I don't know what quite to call him. He's like a boundary line, like Desmond himself is, between philosophy and theology.
Yeah.
He really represents a postmodern take on what we're doing when we're talking and failing to talk about God, what we're doing when we are engaged in religion. And so Caputo brings the Heideggerian, post-Heideggerian, postmodern critique of, Heidegger's ontotheological critique, right? God can't be any kind of thing, not even the biggest or super thing. And then the critique of transcendence. So what we'll do is we'll take a look, and I chose it this way because I like authors that don't just merely present their ideas monologically, but do this dialogical thing. And I chose both books for that reason. And I won't get into why I think that's important. I have a lot out there on why dialogical reasoning is much better than monological reasoning. So we'll go through that and we'll wrestle with that. And this will be the beginning, and this will be more oriented towards, the philosophical as the act of theoretical speculation into ontology, metaphysics, the nature of cognition, things like that. But then we will follow it with a second book, Spiritual Exercises for a Secular Age, Desmond and the Quest for God. And this is by Duns, with a foreword, by the way, by William Desmond. And what Duns is doing, he is explicitly, and he talks about this, and we'll go through it. He's talking about Pierre Hadot's notion of philosophy as a spiritual exercise, as a way of life in which one is cultivating wisdom, which doesn't just mean being sort of smart or saying esoteric things. It means deeply connecting with what is most deep and real within you to what is most deep and real without you. And now here, the person that Duns puts Desmond into dialogue with is not Caputo, it's Charles Taylor. And Charles Taylor, of course, has done some of the most important work about what the sacred is like in what Taylor calls the secular age. And we will also pick up on how does William Desmond afford us a way of spiritual exercise in which we not just contemplate in that weak modern sense the sacred, but we contemplate in the ancient theoria sense. We undergo transformation. We reorient towards the sacred. That's this book. And so I'm not completely happy with the term, but this is, there's a lot of theory in here, but it's much more oriented towards, practice, transformative practice.
Well, theoria or theorein means to take into consideration, to see, to behold in seeing. It's a specific way of seeing, and that usually leads to praxis.
Yes.
And praxis is not, by the way, making a table, but I mean Aristotelian terms, but is doing something for its own sake.
Yes.
So you're not producing something, but a genuine practice is something you do something for its own sake.
That's what we'll be doing in the second book. Now, along the way, I will be giving you things to read from this wonderful little anthology. I would recommend this. If you're going to start reading Desmond directly, start here. So that's why we're using it in the course. This is the William Desmond Reader, put
Yeah.
together, by the way, by Christopher Ben Simpson. There he is again. So a
Mhm.
nice unity of voice running through this. And we'll be using excerpts from this, which are some of the best excerpts from a lot of the main work. And Desmond has, being in the between, God in the between, ethics in the between. And this is all drawn from that. So we'll also be, I'll make reference of the actual texts from Desmond, as well as we're making our way through the Ben Simpson book, and as we're making our way through the Dunn's book. There'll typically be an hour and 20-minute lecture, and then a 40-minute Q&A. And it is an ongoing, continuous argument. If you've taken any of my courses before, I don't do surveys. I don't move topic to topic. I start and I build. Every lecture is an argument that contributes a premise to an overall argument of the entire course.
Yep. Excellent. So, again, 2nd of April is when we begin. We're now going to some questions. If you have any questions, by the way, let us know in the chat and we'll try and get to them. Here's a weird one.
Okay, weird is good.
Magnus asks, can shamanism, the functionality often used, be found in something as simple as an app?
So I'm going to take it that you mean shamanism in a rich sense, not sort of modern urban neo-shamanism or something like that, where people are...
That's a new course. Urban neo-shamanism. That's 2026. Okay, cool.
Where you mean by shamanism, altered states of an ecology of practices that involve an altered state of consciousness, dance, imaginal practices where you're identifying with other beings, either animals or mythological beings, and that you engage in this journey that has a narrative structure that gives you fundamental insight into what's going on in people's lives. I talked about a lot in the Awakening for the Meaning Crisis, which, there's the book up there, is now out on Amazon, and how we can explain a lot of shamanism in terms of cognitive science. I've also am very hesitant of shamanism removed from the world in which it evolved and to which it is adapted, namely a nomadic existence of hunter-gatherers. This is why I'm very sort of like about urban, post-agricultural, post-industrial, post-computational revolution, sedentary shamanism. I'm very hesitant around that. I'm not completely dismissive. I've met some people that I do take seriously, but that goes towards my point. I don't know if an app is rich enough to capture everything I was just talking about. I don't want to foreclose. Many people are smarter than me, and can make wonderful things. But I would put a very high bar about it trying to teach you a way of life, give you a role model, help you to alter consciousness, help you to integrate the weird stuff you're liable to encounter in that into your existing worldview, connect to other people in a shared community, and do something that involves you with the natural world analogous to what shamanism did. So I can't make a deductive argument that it's impossible, but I just gave you an argument why I regard it as something I would be very, very suspicious of. I'd need a lot of convincing before I would say, yeah, that's shamanism.
Here's Harris.
Hey, Harris.
How might Desmond's work on the between metaxu spaces provide a new perspective on the study of 4E cognition?
Well, depends who you mean new to. If you mean new to me, maybe not that much, but new to a lot of people in 4E Cog Sci, I think so. Now, stepping aside from my ego-stroking egocentrism, what I mean by that is I have been making a lot of arguments for the deep connections between 4E cognitive science and a return of Neoplatonism, not just in terms of worldview, but also in terms of an epistemology and an aspirational psychology. And many of you have seen that I've been making those talks. This connects to work I've been doing on extended naturalism, transcendent naturalism. Of course, I'm teaching on on my platform, the lectern right now, realizing the imaginal. And so I think the best framework, dialogically altered by being integrated with 4 cog psi. So a reciprocal reconstruction between 4 cog psi and Neoplatonism is giving birth to something, again, which I will not call Neoplatonism. But I think Desmond is terrifically helpful to me. I have learned a lot about how to make a better case for that integration between 4 cognitive science and this renewed, revised, transframed Neoplatonism that restores Platonism back to both spiritual exercise and rich phenomenological analysis or reflection. I don't think we should use the word analysis for phenomenology. It's too misleading to Western ears. So I'll just say phenomenological reflection.
Great, thank you. Here is Mark. The between is very evocative. Is it intimate, like presence, suspended, like between heaven and earth?
Yes, there is a tremendous intimacy. So this is his words, not mine. He calls it the intimate stranger. So the between has the intimacy you're pointing to of presence, but it has the strangeness of profound withdrawal. The withdrawal is your ongoing recognition of a transcendence that transcends any of your attempts to get a final conception of transcendence. That's, by the way, what he means by absolute transcendence. He means once you think you know what transcendence is, you open it up to go beyond. You have to transcend any sense of transcendence that you have. And what he says is when you get this kind of trajectory of transcendences, sorry for the torturing of the language, you get a sense of God as he is trying to understand it. The metaxu is the intimate stranger or the intimate strangeness. He uses sometimes a more personal stranger and sometimes more impersonal strangeness, and that's completely appropriate. And so the answer is yes and no. In a very powerful way. So think about your relationship of loving trust, and love is a big deal to Desmond, to your beloved. There should be an intimate strangeness there. You should feel profoundly connected to them while also continually challenged, struck by the mystery of how they transcend any idea or concept you have. I mean, that's beauty. Beauty is in an intimate strangeness. That's what beauty is. The appearances are intimate to you. They reach deeply into you, but they call you to a depths you have not seen or foreseen. So beauty also plays a big role in Desmond, as it does in Plato.
Yeah. Or else it's, to be crass, sorry, pornography is the opposite.
Yes.
Of erotic.
Yep.
Which leaves itself to a certain degree always concealed and withdrawing and absconding itself. Here's my mate Chev Loveland, excited for the trilogy's completion. Salute. Cheers to you, Chev. And here's a question that actually has to do with that. Gamma Beta asks, I was not yet able to take up the God and Ultimate Reality course. How does this course plug into that one? Would it be advisable not to skip the second one, etc.?
No, there's no problem with taking this course. I will teach this course as if the students have not taken the trilogy, but I will also teach it, and I'm up to this challenge, I think. I will also teach it in a way so that people who have taken the other courses will be able to look back at those courses from this course and, oh yes, and make valuable connections. So I think you can just pick this course up, but it won't, right? It's not simply an extending of the other two. It stands alone, but I'm trying to make it both stand alone and resonate with the other two. And I have had to do this before
Yeah.
at the university and other things where I've taught sequences of courses.
In a way, this is. I often get the question, "Where did you begin with philosophy?" And I say, "How did you learn how to swim?"
Yeah.
um, well, let's take a 500-hour theory course for a 4-year-old and teach the child theoretically how to swim, or you throw it in the water and make sure
Yeah.
the child
Yeah.
doesn't drown. With philosophy, it's quite similar. I'm actually serious. You can actually begin anywhere because in philosophy is ultimately systematic, which means it's not a big grand system, but it means that it's all connected. And I'm going to make the crazy hands. But it actually is all connected. You read Plato. Well, you can actually stop with Plato. No, I'm kidding. But if you read a bit of Neoplatonism, you have to understand Plato, but you also have to need to get at least some notion of what Heraclitus is after, etc. So you begin where you are always. So there's no yes, you can take certain classes, etc., but you can basically begin almost anywhere and then work your way. If this speaks to you, anything in philosophy really, if it draws you in, that's when you have to begin here. If it doesn't, then no. But that's how I would approach these things. And then also the good thing about a course is that you force yourself to focus.
Hmm.
As wonderful as YouTube is, and I use it a lot, one of the issues is that we get scatterbrain and get addicted to content, etc. So instead of that, if you focus in for 8, 9, 10 weeks on one subject in a group, you're forced to read, guided by a wonderful teacher, obviously in this case also. So
Thank you.
you will. This is what actually is more important than having done all the preparatory work, which is the work itself, is to remain focused. That's more important than the other things. Okay, here's another one by Mills. I'm not finding right now. I think I'm going to find it in a second. Marcel asks, "Will you speak about dreams in your course?" Seems relevant.
Oh, I had I hadn't intended to. There's nothing specifically in any of these three books about dreams per se. I will speak about something that overlaps with a discussion of dreams, which is this ongoing work I've been doing about um, the imaginal, because part of what I'm going to argue in this course is the imaginal is how we best have a noetic and Gnostic, not Gnostic in like the creepy two worlds, but the Greek term from Gnosis as a kind of knowing. We have a noetic and Gnostic knowing of Metaxu. This, of course, is based on a lot of work uh, that I've been doing about the imaginal. The imaginal is not the imaginary, and the
Yeah.
imaginal is not just the creation of an image. But one way of understanding Headley, sorry, I just showed my hand. You can one way of understanding Desmond is through the work of my friend
Mm.
Douglas Headley,
Mm-hmm.
where you have the notion of the iconic imagination. And one way of understanding what Desmond is doing is that once you realize that experience is properly metaxu, yes, living forms
That's
of imagination. Yeah, that's the
another
first one.
trilogy.
Yes, another trilogy. Wonderful trilogy, by the way. And once you understand your experience, that your experience and your attention and your conception, all of that, your sense making as a broad category. Once you understand it as properly uh, metaxu, then
Mm.
uh, your experience becomes iconic. There is something here, but it is always between you and that which is transcendent. But it's also it's also how it's not only how you look out into the transcendent, and
Mm-hmm.
don't get too anthropomorphic here, but it's also how the transcendent looks back and into you. This is Eckhart's, right? The same eye by which I see God is the eye by which he sees me. And that's also part of what's going on in Desmond's notion. And when you get the depth psychological understanding of dreams, perhaps not so much in Freud, because he remains completely immanent to the psyche. But
Yeah.
the later Jung, where dreams start to become imaginal like that, then you can start to, and you get a metapsychological notion of synchronicity. Then there's connection that way. I won't explicitly be doing it. I will make connections to the imaginal, and then I think that will help you to make connections to dreams.
So that's what the seminars are really great for, obviously,
Yes.
to point this out. Okay. There's another question by Chance. Can this mode of being, I think he means the fourfold mode
Yeah.
of being, be characterized as a Sisyphus-like asymptotic pursuit or an actual being with?
So he would. Sorry, you're triggering Camus for me, and I was just in a very, very good conversation about how Camus. I mean, he wrote his thesis on Christian Neoplatonism, and Christian Neoplatonism is running all through Camus. He has, of course, the lucidity that is the ultimate touchstone of reality, and it's an inexpressible light, but that is transcends intelligibility, but allows us to realize and see through, and it's all this really interesting stuff. Um, I'm making a very long argument, too short and poorly, but Camus isn't sort of as self-enclosed. This comes out better in his novels, by the way, like The Plague.
Mm-hmm.
Now, all that being said, I still take your meaning, and Desmond would say it's a proper being with. So Desmond says the proper realization of the metaxu is a community of beings. It is not a system in which everything is relegated and regimented. It is not just a heap or a collection. It is a community in which there is this betweenness that is shared. There is a common unity, but the unity isn't a unity to a thing. It's a unity of between. And that is what he says is that's not only with other people, we have a community with all beings.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you understand that as one plausible interpretation of Mitsein, being with, then I think he would say it's being with.
Mm-hmm. Excellent, thank you. Ram asks, what distinguishes embodied practice from simply going to the gym? And what is its role in being in the in-between, as you mentioned, is important for Desmond?
So embodied practice, I mean, we have to be really careful here. I mean, everything you do is embodied. So I take it what you mean is a reflective appreciation, apprehension, and appropriation of your embodiment. I'm going to take that's what you mean by embodiment. And as soon as you say that, you realize that going to the gym often involves in no way a recognition, a recognition, and a re-inhabiting of your embodiment, because your embodiment is properly in between. Your body isn't this contained thing. This is what 4E Cog Sci is about, your embodiment. And this is Merleau-Ponty. And there's going to be some connections between Merleau-Ponty and William Desmond, right? Your embodiment is transjective. You are constantly making yourself in and from your environment, and you are shaping your environment, and it is shaping you. It is all metaxu. And embodiment practices are about, and I'm using this in the way I always use it, double sense, about realizing the transjectivity of your embodiment, not just the caloric expenditure of moving your muscles. There is a wisdom cultivation, a virtue and virtuosity cultivation through a kind of ritual reflection upon your embodiment, an apprehension, appreciation, appropriation of it, that is proper to embodiment practices that exceeds exercise. Of course, you should exercise. Don't quote me as saying John said we don't need to exercise. That's ridiculous. You have metabolic needs. I'm not saying that, but you also have psychological, existential, and sapiential needs, and those are the aspects of your body that are cultivated in embodiment practices. And if you understand embodiment the way I just explained it, you see why those practices of embodiment are ways in which we non-propositionally, make contact with, inhabit how we are properly metaxu.
Thank you very much. I think we've time maybe for one or two more questions, and then John has got to go. So in the meantime, do sign up to the course. He is Eiderbold. How does Desmond approach the concept of human being, or Heidegger's notion of Dasein, if that's relevant? Is his approach more of a how to cope with the existential ambiguity, or what is there to be coped with?
That's an interesting question. I think he's trying to go. It's. I mean, sorry. One is always infected by what one is currently reading.
Yeah, yeah.
And I'm reading some work on Heidegger and Platonism, and whether, and there's this ongoing dispute, which I'm not going to try and even comment on here, about whether or not there's a real turning if the late Heidegger is fundamentally different than the early Heidegger. Does Dasein go all the way through, or is Dasein replaced by being? And then some people even argue later concepts like the holy and stuff like that. And so it's hard to answer that question because I don't. Heidegger is not so much a thing as a spectrum. And so trying to answer it is a little bit tricky. But let's say we take it sort of, sort of an existential in the, like French existentialism notion of that. Then I think Desmond is trying to go beyond that. Desmond is, precisely because he's not just in the phenomenological tradition that is behind existentialism, he is also deeply reaching into and recovering the Platonic tradition through this revitalized revisioning and rereading. And I think that gives him an important difference because a lot of existentialism, not all existentialism, but a lot of existentialism and a lot of Heideggerians see Plato as something of the villain. And this is the Nietzschean.
Platonism.
Yes, Platonism. Fair enough. Yes. And I think what what Johannes just referred to as Platonism, like I don't think much of Platonism. If what you mean by that is the two worlds mythology, where the real world is mathematically eternal perfect beings and all that stuff. But I do think this, like I said, I think this moves us out of the preponderance of immanence that you find in the notion of Dasein. I know there's ecstasis in Dasein, but it's still something that folds back in, at least in the earlier Heideggers, especially in the existentialists. No exit, start, no exit. Come on, right? And in that sense, what we're talking about is Desmond is saying, yeah, there's an exit. In fact, they're the opposite, thinking that there could be a foreclosure, an enclosing is a profound mistake.
Yeah. Good. It's always good to give Sartre a beating.
I mean, I think that's one. I think we should make that a club. People who think Sartre is overrated.
It's very overrated. Yes. I mean, it's fun when you're 15.
Yeah, it's fun when you're 15. But
14.
Marcel is as accessible as Sartre and a lot more fruitful to read.
Yeah. People, don't forget to enroll. Now is the time to do so. This is the final question. I think this is something you may have mentioned somewhere else. Could you expound upon why you have said you think theology is the discipline of the future? And why theology rather than philosophy? What's the relation between the two?
This is a wonderful question because this is also William Desmond. He situates himself metaxu, philosophy, theology, because he says, right, we can't get at what we need to get at by trying to remain within the academic silos of philosophy and theology. Why did I say theology? When I use that, I'm talking sort of to a broadly current audience, and I know that's who I'm talking to, because I'm talking to people who are concerned about the possible advent of AGI, artificial general intelligence. And what I meant by this, and then I'll bring it back to Desmond, is that as these machines get good at the technical manipulation of literate linguistic propositional information, they will challenge many people who have identified both their self and their humanity with the technical manipulation of literate linguistic proposition. And think here of Marcuse and One Dimensional Man, right? And so there's going to be an enhanced incentive. Some people will just suffer that in all the meanings of suffer, but there's going to be an enhanced prioritization of that aspect of us that is not capturable by the propositional knowing. So from the depths of our non-propositional ineffable embodiment in an axis towards how we relate to ultimacy in an ineffable fashion, that, right, I call it the somatic spiritual axis, that is going to become more and more profound. And I think for all of its defaults, that is the axis that theology has tried to keep it before our eyes. Now, I don't think theology as it is going to meet the demand I've just said. I think theology is going to need to go through profound revision. And I think it's precisely going to meet philosophy going through a revision where we're moving out of academic philosophy back into the kind of philosophy that is practiced right here on Halkien. And that philosophy with spiritual exercises in a way of life, and this revisioned theology about this axis are going to meet. And when you know who we're going to meet when we meet there? William Desmond. That's where he explicitly saw himself being. So William Desmond, this sounds crazy, I know. William Desmond is actually one of the best people to read in order to get a philosophical framework that can orient you optimally towards the challenge that these machines are going to make upon us at a psychological, existential, and spiritual level.
Excellent. I think, so Harris just says halcyon days.
Yeah.
It's named after the mythic kingfisher, the ice bird, who breeds and gives new life around winter solstice. Here's Christopher Ben Simpson.
What?
Yes. Sounds like a wonderful, hopefully alternating, perplexing, and astonishing cause. Glad to contribute indirectly.
Oh, Christopher, well, thank you so much. I have been so deeply influenced by your reading, by reading your work and studying it, and so much. Wow. It's a great pleasure to meet you, even indirectly through text. I would love to talk to you at some time if you'd ever like that. I hope I'm treating your text well. Just thank you for that that note of encouragement. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I guess Dr. Simpson, I should say. I don't know. Or Professor, even. Thank you very much indeed. I wanted to say, well, just because what John just mentioned in the beginning, of those of you who were here in the beginning, I mentioned briefly a project that was born in Silicon Valley where the approach is more to just extend, in terms of what Hegel would call the bad infinite, the finite. So the purely somatic, to live as long as possible. That will be the new task, which neglects the non-propositional knowing, because it understands knowledge only as information or propositional, etc. So this was a wonderful way to close this. I'd like to invite you all again to join the course. The link to enroll is in the description of this video, and also several times here in the chat. There's also here this QR code that you can scan, which is this one. Again, we begin on the 2nd of April, which is a Wednesday, 6 p.m. UK time. That's 7 p.m. Central European time, 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, and I think 10 a.m. Pacific time. So usually we get a good group of Northern Americans and Europeans, and sometimes even the odd Australian who's crazy enough to get up in the morning. That's happened as well. And also people from India have joined in. So if you'd like to join us, that would be great. John will be guiding us through Desmond and other thinkers for 8 weeks straight. This time there will be no breaks.
That's right.
So we're able to go ahead for 8 weeks. You find also a list of what the lectures are in detail here on the enrollment page. So you have a full lecture schedule to know what to expect. And also we've made public here what you will be reading for every week. So you can, if you sign up now, you can get started on the readings and, well, you'll be prepared, let's say, once we start. Any closing remarks from you, John?
Just as always, my friend, thank you. You know how strongly I support Halkyn and your vision for bringing philosophy back to its proper locus and its proper practice. I admire you for that, and I value our friendship. I don't know if
Likewise.
Christopher Ben Simpson is still listening. If you reach out to me, john.vervaeke@gmail.com, it'd be great to talk to you. And I want to thank all the people here. Wonderful questions. I continue to be impressed by the quality, the caliber of the, even that you can tell the erudition behind the questions that I get asked by the Halkyn students. It takes me, I'll be Vygotsky for 5 seconds. It takes me into the zone of proximal development where I can most also deeply learn. As I stretch myself to try and answer your questions, I sometimes can see things that I couldn't see before. So thank you very much.
It's all about seeing. And this beautiful English word to behold. To
Yes.
behold, to hold in seeing. Actually, it holds you too.
Yes.
It's not just one-sided. It's a beholding from all angles. Okay, so again, you're cordially invited to join us. The link to enroll is in the description of this video. Share the video with anyone you think might be interested in these questions. This is, after all, the 21st century. We should finally take charge and let the 20th century die. Maybe the other 2,000 years before too. Just kidding. But the new atheism fad has ended. And people are looking for something. There's an openness that I wouldn't have expected even 10 years ago. When speaking of the sacred, etc., was all just basically academic interest or something peculiar in Heidegger, let's say, for example, if it even came up. But now there's a genuine opening, I think, a kairos, an opening. So thank you again, John. Thank you, everyone, for listening. And we'll see you in a couple of weeks inside.
Take good care, everyone.
Take good care.